Hello, everybody. Thanks for joining me today. My name is Kevin Hancock, Director of Solutions here at Exostar. And I'm going to go ahead and give 2 minutes for people who might be running a little late a chance to join up. So we'll go ahead and start the presentation at 2 minutes past the hour. Hello again, everybody. If you've just joined us and are wondering why it is so quiet, I'm going to give 1 more minute for people who might be running a little late a chance to join up. So we're going to actually start the webinar at 2 minutes past the hour. Thanks so much for your patience. All right, everybody, let's go ahead and get started. So once again, my name is Kevin Hancock, Director of Solutions here at Exostar, and thanks for joining me for today for navigating CMMC compliance in 2025, key deadlines and steps to stay ahead. This is the first of our 2025 webinars for CMMC. We do these once a month, the third Wednesday of every month, same time. So if you're interested, please take a look at our events page on www.exostar.com and sign up for next month's as well. Before I get started with the actual webinar, let me go through a couple housekeeping details. So today's session is lasts 45 minutes to an hour. It does include question and answer. Now, you're going to be muted during today's presentation. However, a number of folks submitted questions when you signed up, and those are the ones I've got keyed up to answer at the end of today's session. If for some reason we do have an outage, just wait for a minute and try to reconnect. You can either just refresh your screen or go to the email you received with today's invite and click on the link there. It should bring you back into the session. If at any time you've got a question about CMMC, one of the Exostar solutions, you can reach out to one of our experts via email at cmmc-team@exostar.com, or you can come to our website, www.exostar.com. There's a chat feature there on every page, and we'd be more than happy to answer your questions that way as well. So with that, let's dive ahead into today's presentation. So a lot's been going on this week, obviously, not just the cold weather, but changes of administration, et cetera. And so a number of people probably have questions about kind of where we are in the CMMC process, and if anything that's been done in the last week is going to change that. So I'm going to answer. So I've got some material about that to kind of level set everybody. We're going to talk about what to do as you start to ramp up that CMMC program, the information you need to gather, how to go through and do a self-assessment so you know where you are in the process. If you're ready to actually engage with that certified third-party assessment organization. And then, as I mentioned before, I'll go ahead and answer some questions that came in before today's session. So, as you know, CMMC is making its way through the rulemaking process. The Department of Defense has issued the rules, and they are in effect. And what I mean by that is on 12/16 of last year, of 2024, 32 of the Code of Federal Regulations went into effect. And this basically enabled the Department of Defense to start to initiate the CMMC program and put in place the scoping guide, the assessment guide, etc. It's what now enables those certified third-party assessment organizations to start to schedule you for those third-party assessments. However, 48 CFR isn't yet finalized. The proposed rule came out last week on 1/15/2025, and that's the FARS clause that allows the Department of Defense and other federal agencies to start to require NIST 800-171 and for the DoD, especially the CMMC program, to govern how controlled unclassified information is shared and the requirements around that. So that isn't yet in effect. So therefore, you're not yet going to start to see those things in contracts. However, be assured that these things are moving forward. Now, there is the main difference between what's currently in place and the CMMC program is that in years past, you've been required to secure controlled unclassified information in accordance with NIST 800-171. It was a self-attestation model. You said that you did it, you signed the contract, and you were good. The one thing that CMMC changes is we've moved away from that self-attestation model to requiring third-party assessments. And I'll cover the CMMC program and the different levels and what are required as well. Now, it also defines some terms. One of those is a cloud service provider. These are services you may engage with from third parties to store, process, or transmit controlled unclassified information. If you do, that cloud service provider needs to be in the FedRAMP marketplace and marked as FedRAMP moderate. If you're engaging with a third party to help you out with certain things, including leveraging a cloud service that they might be managing on your behalf, you're engaging what's called an external service provider. Those are folks, they're not necessarily, they may be working on behalf of you, but they're managing something on your behalf. Now, those folks, they're not required to obtain CMMC certification, but the services they provide to you will be assessed as part of your overall CMMC assessment. Now, obviously, we had a change of administrations on Monday. And one of the presidential actions that took place on Monday was there was put in place a regulatory freeze. Now, this does not stop the CMMC program, right? CMMC was written into the Code of Federal Regulations before the change in administration, but that 48 CFR is affected, if you will, and it may delay the CMMC appearing in contracts, but it shouldn't really delay, or it shouldn't impact the implementation of the CMMC program. I fully expect the CMMC program to continue forward because this was a priority in the previous Trump administration. It's gone through different parties. It started under President Obama. It went through the Trump administration. It went through the Biden administration. And it's always been a priority of the Department of Defense to secure controlled unclassified information. So with that said, right, what is the CMMC program? So what this, as I mentioned before, is a way to protect information that you receive from the Department of Defense because you're fulfilling a contract or you're a subcontractor to someone that is. It breaks those requirements into 3 different levels. Right? Level 1 This is for those organizations, and this is the majority of the defense industrial base, right? 63% of the defense industrial base will only require level 1. What that means is you receive federal contract information, but you don't necessarily receive any controlled unclassified information. So if you're at level 1, there are 15 requirements that you need to self-assess and annually affirm that you do. And then you'll continue on. Now, if you receive controlled unclassified information, you're going to fall in one of 2 levels, level 2 or level 3. The majority of you would be level 2, right? This is 35% of, or actually 37% of the defense industrial base. So you receive controlled unclassified information. You're going to be required to do that third-party assessment of your compliance with NIST 800-171. And currently, it's NIST 800-171 Rev 2. This third-party assessment is good for 3 years. So once every 3 years, you'll need to engage with a third party to verify that you do what you say you do. Then you'll have to affirm that you do this annually. You haven't made any changes, or if you have, you've accounted for them, etc. Now, level 2 is broken up into 2 categories. There are some, and this is a small percentage, will still be under a self-assessment, but the majority will be under the third-party assessment. The key thing to remember here is really with the third party, with whether or not you get a third party or not, it's going to be up to the contracting officer from the Department of Defense. They're the ones, when they let the contract, will determine what the clause is in the contract and whether or not that clause is going to allow a self-assessment. It won't be something that you can request. It's just going to come as part of the contract vehicle. And then a small number of you may receive that critical CUI. And if you do, you're going to be a level 3 organization. This requires you to meet the requirements of level 2. So that's the NIST 800-171 R2. Plus, there are additional 24 controls from NIST 800-172. Your self-assessment will be done by DIBCAC. That's the audit organization for the Department of Defense once every 3 years. And again, you'll have to do an annual affirmation. Now, as you go through that assessment, if somebody finds a problem, only certain controls are going to be allowed to not be implemented. Those controls, if they're found, you'll have 180 days to close. Then you'd re-engage with that assessment organization to come out, review that you fixed it, and then you'll be passed, if you will, and you'll receive the passing score for that assessment. Now, you will receive these slides after today's presentation. The links on here are links to the information you see. So, if you need a reminder, want to know any additional background information, feel free to use the resources that we provide for you as well. Now, when CMMC is implemented, right, and we're still waiting for that final rule to go into place, but when it does take effect, so when that 48 CFR is actually in effect, CMMC is going to be implemented in a phased rollout. Phase 1 is going to continue the self-assessment model. And that's going to last approximately 12 months, right? So when CMMC does take effect, when it starts to appear in contracts, for that first year, that's that phase-in period to give you a chance to go ahead and start to set up your requirement for that third-party assessment. DoD understands that that's not going to happen overnight. So that's why you have this year phase 1 period. Phase 2 is when you'll start to see that you're required to have that level 2 certification. After 2 years, so phase 3, that's where you're going to start to see those level 3 certifications come into play, where you're going to need a DIBCAC assessment once every 3 years if you're in level 3. And if you are going for that level 3, or if you're required for level 3, just keep in mind that you've got to be level 2 first and then go for level 3. So, you'll still have to pay attention to phase 2. And then phase 4, right, after that 3-year period, we would expect a full implementation of the program, right? All 3 levels, the different requirements will be in place. If you see a contract with these requirements in, you'll need to have those requirements completed before you bid on that contract. Now, one caveat to all of this is that statement at the bottom there, because this is also in the rule, right? In some procurements, DoD may implement CMMC requirements in advance of the planned phases. So, if there is something that they deem that's that is critical enough, they may require, a third-party assessment for level 2 before that initial implementation period is completed. So just keep that in mind, that there is that caveat. All right, so before CMMC comes into play, right, we still have requirements that are necessary today. Right? So if you take a look at your contracts, and you may have certain DFARS clauses, and DFARS stands for Defense Federal Acquisition Regulation. If you've got 252.204, 7012, 7019, or 7020, these all, if you will, revolve around the requirement to implement NIST 800-171 if you receive controlled unclassified information as part of a contract. So if you've got those clauses in your contract, then you say that you meet the NIST 800-171 requirements. Now, you're allowed to have POAMs in the existing rules, so you may not have all the controls implemented, but you should have a POAM, and POAM stands for a plan of action and milestone, to close that control to ensure that you do enforce that at a particular date, and you should be tracking your closure to that. If you've got that 7019 clause in your contract, you're required to score yourself on an assessment. And I'll cover how you do this in subsequent slides. But you do that self-assessment and you score yourself. And then you enter that score into the supplier performance risk system. That's the SPRS system. You'll have created a cage code. You'll go in, you'll enter your score underneath that cage code. And then the Defense Department uses that score as one of the evaluation methods of your overall supplier risk. It's not everything that goes into your supplier risk score, but it is one value that's considered. So they'll use that when deciding upon contracts. So the higher your score, you do have a leg up, if you will, in the bid process as one factor that can be considered when letting a contract. You may also find that certain prime contractors that you may be a sub to have started to reach out to you over the last year, 18 months, to ask you what your SPRS score is. And they may also be using that in determining whether or not they'll let you bid on certain contracts or utilize you for a particular service in fulfillment of a contract, because this is an expectation of these requirements. Okay, so as you start to look at CMMC, you'll want to evaluate, kind of where you are in the process and what you may need to do to get ready for the overall assessment. And you should always kind of start with that self-assessment process, right? You need to know kind of where you are and what you need to do to get this done. So the first thing I would always recommend you do is to figure out where in your organization controlled unclassified information comes in. Now, if you are a COT supplier, commercial off the shelf, and that's all you do, you may not receive any controlled unclassified information, and that's okay. In those cases, you're a level 1, right? So you'd be a CMMC level 1. You don't receive controlled unclassified information. So you would focus on ensuring that you meet those 15 requirements. But if you do receive CUI, controlled unclassified information, you're going to want to figure out where that information comes into your organization, right? How do I receive this? Does it come as part of an RFP or an RFI? Does it only become once as part of a purchase order or an invoice or a sales order to my organization? Is that how I'm receiving it? Am I getting design documents or other requirements that are marked CUI as part of this fulfillment? How do they come into my organization? Who in my organization works on those? Who, if you will, who and what stores, processes, and transmits CUI? So, if I get these orders in, where do I store them? In my organization, who gets these files? Who maybe has to manipulate them? Right? If I'm giving drawings, do I have to, make my own drawings based on those? And then I also have to mark those CUI. I have to store it, etc. Who in my organization has access to those files? And that includes my tech support team and maybe I have a third party that manages certain systems for me. So are they included in that flow, and do they have access to it? And then, obviously, how does that kind of information leave my system? Does it, or is it just when the contract is done, we turn over all information to our the contracting body, or do we just destroy it as part of the requirements? And it never really leaves our system, but we have to account for how we destroy it. And some of these things may be physical. This isn't just an IT issue. So keep that in mind when you start to think about this. There are physical controls and security controls about your location and those kinds of things also as part of the controls. As you build out that data flow, you want to take a look at the system diagram and boundary. Now, and this is all taken from the assessment guide, right? There is a NIST 800-171 alpha. That's the assessment guide. There's also an assessment guide around CMMC. It's called a scoping document. And that scoping document basically designates the different things in your network or in that data flow, right? One of those is CUI assets, right? These are, as I mentioned before, those things that process, store, or transmit that information. You also have things that don't necessarily store data, right? Like the network itself or a firewall. Those things are security protection assets, right? If it's physical, right, and you've got a security camera that's observing a particular area, that's a security protection asset. It doesn't store, process, or transmit CUI, but it's there to secure it. So those security protection assets are something else you need to account for. Because at the end of the day, all of this is defining the overall system. Because what we're building is a system security plan. And your system security plan, kind of based on your business, is either going to be across your entire organization because, everybody and everything in your organization is involved in that CUI flow, or maybe you're in your organization, only certain people, only certain areas, only certain parts of the business are involved in, say, your DoD contracts. Then only those folks really have to be part of that overall system. And so where you build that system boundary should account for where you store, process, or transmit CUI, the different things that you have to secure that, those security protection assets. If you're utilizing a third party to assist in any of this, those are those contractor risk managed assets, right? You may have contractors who do things like control your logs or are reporting on your logs or are identifying things like that. You may have a contractor who manages your endpoints or is responsible for a portion of your IT, or maybe you outsource all of your IT. Then those folks may have certain assets that they manage on your behalf to manage your overall system. Specialized assets, these are typically those IoT devices or outside, they're part of your they might be in your building, they might be on the network, etc. But they're not necessarily, they don't store, process, or transmit CUI. They're not really part of it. But those specialized assets need to be accounted for. You need to understand, kind of what they do and what they are. And you got to make sure that there are no, threats involved with those. And then obviously there are out of scope assets. Those, again, they exist and they're there, but they're not part of your system. They're not part of that boundary. Because at the end of the day, this is when you engage with that certified third party, you're going to tell them the extent of your system and the extent of that boundary. Then, as they assess your organization and the different pieces of that system, they'll, let you know, obviously as part of this, that, well, maybe your boundary needs to be expanded, or, you're not going to pass this assessment because you didn't account for these three things that need to be part of it. Let's fix those, and then we'll come out and reassess. So this is all about NIST 800-171, and the CMMC program is tied to the NIST 800-171 controls. And these are 110 individual controls across the 14 categories or 14 families that you see here. They're not evenly distributed, right? And some of these there are 3, and some of these there are 4, 6, or some other number. But there are 110 controls across these different 14 categories. And how you implement each of those controls is what is going to be determined by you first. And then that's what's going to be evaluated by the assessor when they come on site. Now, when you're doing your self-assessment, because you really should take the first pass at this to to determine where you are and what you may need to do. So in each of these different controls, and the example you see here is taken straight from that 800-171 alpha, that assessment guide, it's going to ask you certain questions, right? So the overall security requirement of this is control the flow of controlled unclassified information in accordance with approved authorizations. So, how do you authorize people or systems to store, process, or transmit CUI, right? Do you have policies that are in place to enforce that? What methods are you using to enforcement? Where are those designated sources, the networks, the individuals, and devices for CUI within that system boundary? And so as you ask yourself these questions, right, make sure you've got this written down, right? So you need, what is your policy for authorizing access to systems that control controlled unclassified information? So what is your access control policy? Make sure you have that written down. Make sure you have an implementation statement of what you do to actually enforce that policy. Make sure you then have evidence to support that you do those kinds of things. So for example, if as one of your examples, I don't know, you say we use roles and permissions in our Active Directory group to lock down access to these systems. You should then have a screenshot of those Active Directory groups, and you should be able to show that assessor what you do to set those, how you assign someone into them, how when somebody leaves your organization, you remove them from the group. All of those things are your evidence to support that you do those things. And then you need to make sure that you test or that you train the folks that are doing these activities how to do them, right? So if people can request access to a particular system, then your folks should know how to submit that request. If you've got an approval process for approving that access, the folks that are doing that should be trained on how to do that. And then, right, the assessor is going to test those individuals that are responsible for that as part of the overall assessment. So typically, the way assessments will work is you'll engage with a certified third party. They will, basically kind of give you a schedule. And part of that schedule is the first thing they're going to ask for you are all of those policies and procedures and evidence. And this will be a few weeks before they actually start the assessment, because they'll review those to make sure you've got all of that information available to them, and they can review it. They'll then kind of develop their plan to look at these things, what they're going to look at, who they're going to look at, who in your organization they need to ask these questions of. Then they'll schedule the assessment itself. Takes some number of days, and I'm not really sure what those number of days are, but it typically depends on the size of the organization, whether or not it's multiple sites or just one, or maybe it's all remote people, etc. Then they'll schedule that assessment, and that's where they'll start to look at they'll look at the evidence. They'll ask questions of individuals, and they'll verify that you've implemented these controls. And people are going to look to see if you've got, that you've implemented all 110 controls, and they're going to do these things across those different controls. So when you're doing your assessment, the NIST 801 guide basically gives you scores on the different controls. Each control is worth 1, 3, or 5 points. So this is basically how you're creating that score that you're going to enter into the SPRS system. So as you score yourself, right, it's going to be a 1, 3, or 5 if you've implemented a particular control. So your score is going to range somewhere from a -203 to 110. Now, when the assessor is on site, it's okay if you don't have everything implemented, or if they find a problem, as long as the thing you haven't implemented are those controls that are only worth 1 point. And it's not all 1-pointers are created equally, and that's kind of on the next slide. So I'll show you that in just a minute. But when those assessors are on site, they identify an issue, it's one of those allowed 1-point controls, that's okay, and they'll mark you as not passing yet, and you'll have 180 days to close that. And you'll create a POAM, a plan of action and milestones, to address that particular open item. You should manage that to closure. Then you'll re-engage with the same assessment organization that did that initial engagement. They'll verify that you've done it, right? They're going to look for the evidence. They're going to look for the people who've done it. They're going to, quiz them about it, ask what they do, show me how you do it, etc. Then they'll accept that you've implemented that control, and then you'll get a passing grade, and they'll update the systems accordingly that now your assessment is passed and you're good for 3 years. Now, if you're doing your self-assessment, you should still create a plan of action and milestones for those things you haven't yet implemented, because at the end of the day, you should treat CMMC as a program. This isn't something you do once and forget about it. It's not something you do just once every 3 years and forget about it. And the reason I say that is because a number of these controls have as part of them that you review these things periodically. Or as part of your evidence, they're going to want proof that you've done those things. And some of those things are like training of your individuals and that you've verified a policy and those kinds of things. So you should be able to keep track of those things just like you do any overall program. So this is the scoring, right? These are all the different controls. These are the 5 and 3. All the other ones are 1. The links on this page will give you links to that assessment guide and the methodology in which you look at a particular control and how you assess that control. And then these are the 1-point controls that you must have in effect, right? These are the 1-pointers that you have to have regardless of or that will count against you when going for that assessment. So make sure you have these in place along with all those 5s and 3s. As I mentioned, if you've got that POAM, you've got to resolve it within 180 days. You go back to that same third party that was doing the assessment, and that third party would be either one you've engaged as that C3PAO, or that you've gone, or is the DIBCAC itself because you're a level 3 and they're doing it. You'll engage with that same organization and they'll certify you. And then you'll be good for the next 3 years, except you'll still have to annually affirm that you do these things. And again, you should treat this as a program because these things will change. You may change technologies, you may change out people or processes, etc. And if you do, that's okay. You've just got to keep track of it, make sure it still meets the requirements, and mark that accordingly, document it accordingly. So when you're ready for your next certification process, it's quick and easy for you. Now, Exostar has some tools and some applications that can help you throughout this process. The first one is when you're looking to build those different policies, right? You've got those 110 controls across those 14 control families. You need some policies in place to document for your organization what you need to do. So Exostar has an application called Policy Pro, which will give you sample templates of those different policies, allow you to customize those to fit your organization. Or if you've got your own existing policies, that's okay too, right? Bring those to the table, run those through, or any that you've created within Policy Pro through the AI engine in Policy Pro. It'll create a numeric score around that particular policy, and it'll give you indicators of areas you may need to improve upon to either customize that control that you've already done for CMMC, because maybe you did it for like ISO or another requirement, and you may want to tweak some language to meet the requirements of NIST 800-171. So Policy Pro will give you those indicators of what you need and score them for you, and then allow you to version control those, update them, etc. Now, when you're getting ready to do that assessment, Exostar has an application certification assistant that'll walk you through that NIST 800-171 assessment. It allows you to create that system, allows you to upload that data flow diagram and network diagram, etc. It then walks you through each of those 110 controls, allows you to centralize those policy and implementation statements, the evidence, etc. If for some reason you don't have a control in place, it allows you to create the POAM and then manage that POAM to closure. If you got a recurring task around a particular control, it allows you to create those recurring tasks as well. So really provides that place to do the self-assessment, but also manage that overall CMMC program. It'll keep track of that SPRS score for you, and also your progress toward that 110 score that we're all looking to achieve. Now, if you're looking for an enclave to securely store, process, or transmit that controlled unclassified information, Exostar has our managed Microsoft 365 environment. This is an enclave up in Microsoft's Azure GCC High built on top of Teams, managed and supported by Exostar tech ops and support teams. These are US citizens in the US, so can also support your ITAR needs. And with an application embedded within it, which makes the entire enclave satisfy 85 of those 110 controls, is within that enclave itself. And then as you do your assessment, if you need some help, Exostar has a number of partners that really, depending where you are in the process, they can either do a readiness assessment with you to determine where you're at. They can manage your overall CMMC program with and for you. These also include those third-party assessment organizations if you're ready to do and schedule that certified third-party assessment as well. So I'm going to ask my partner in crime, Do, to put up a poll for folks. Love to get your feedback on today's overall presentation. This will also ask you some ideas for additional content you might want to see throughout the year. As I mentioned, we do these webinars once every month on a general CMMC topic, as well as webinars on each of our different solutions around CMMC as well. So let me go ahead and bring up those questions that we received ahead of time. So how can I tell what level my establishment is now? Well, really the best way to do this is take a look at your current contracts and determine whether or not you receive CUI as part of any of those. If you're if none of your contracts have those 7012, 7019, or 7020 clauses in them, then most likely you're just receiving federal contract information and you're a level 1. If they do, then you should probably ask your contracting officers whether or not you are receiving CUI as part of these. Make sure that information is labeled. And if you are, then most likely you'll be level 2 or even possibly level 3, but that one is, a much smaller set of folks. So number 2, I get a lot of email relative to CMMC compliance. Is Exostar going to demand compliance in 2025? Well, so Exostar itself is not a DoD contractor, so we're not going to demand compliance in 2025. However, you may receive questionnaires from other Exostar applications. Exostar does have a number of solutions across this space. That does include an application that a number of primes use to ask you your cybersecurity posture. So you may be receiving a questionnaire from one of those applications via Exostar to ask where you are. Please understand that's coming from one of your prime contractors, and they're the ones asking that question. We're just gathering that information and supplying it back to them. So we're not going to demand compliance, but the Department of Defense or a prime who has those contracts with the Department of Defense is going to start, if they haven't already, start to ask you, what is your current CMMC level, or what is your SPURS score, or something like that. And you may already be receiving those kinds of questions as part of your relationships with those prime contractors. So when does the external certification need to be completed? If we have assessed ourselves as a level 2, is the external assessment required by 2026? So if you remember back to that implementation slide I had for the CMMC program, most of the community expects that final 48 CFR to be in place sometime in 2025. Don't really know yet. Also with that, with the latest rule, it may be delayed some amount of time, but everyone kind of expects it to be in place in 2025. Then With that phase-in period, you'd have a year. So that does take you into 2026, right? So you would most likely have to have that third-party assessment organization complete at level 2 sometime in 2026. Now, remember, you're not going to be able to bid on contracts that require that CMMC level 2 without that third-party assessment being done. So 2026 to have everything complete is probably the right expectation, but I don't really know yet when in 2026 that would be. So number 4, our company is Spurs self-assessed. Great. So you've done good. We need guidance in finding a company that can evaluate our assessment for your accuracy and help guide us for our CMMC 2.0 level 1 self-assessment. How can we find a company that can help evaluate the accuracy of our self-assessment and train us on how to properly answer the questions? And, we get this question a lot because the validity of a self-assessment really, it does have that, how tough are you on yourself? And do you actually understand the full question and the full requirements? Not always easy, especially with technology you may not have any knowledge of or anything that you've implemented in the past. So Exostar does have a number of partners that are what are called RPOs, Registered Practitioner Organizations. So if you go to the Exostar website, look under our partners page, look under CMMC, you'll see some partners there that'll be more than happy to work with you on doing kind of that readiness assessment and or training of your team on it, or even, kind of taking over the CMMC program and working with you on that. Now, you can also go to the organization that's managing this, not really managing, but is the validating body of professionals that are dealing with CMMC. And that's called the CyberAB. So if you go to cyberab.org, that is the organization that's been, if you will, empowered by the Department of Defense to manage that professional ecosystem around CMMC. They have an entire marketplace that allows you to look for those registered practitioner organizations. You can do it by state, you can do it by specialty, a number of different searches, and get a list of people that way as well. So when you receive this slide deck, you'll also get some additional information. This includes that CyberAB, right? So this is that cyberab.org body who can help you out with these things. Just a couple more questions to go. So as a reseller of new off-the-shelf products from manufacturers, how do we identify our compliance requirements? So if you only sell off-the-shelf products, and these are what are typically known as COTS, commercial off-the-shelf products. If that's all you deal with, then that by definition isn't controlled unclassified information. It's typically public on a website, right? So it's not controlled unclassified information. So in those cases, you'll most likely be level 1, right? And so you've got those 15 requirements that you're going to have to comply with. You're going to have to self-assess and self-affirm yearly that you do those things. So number 6, how do you treat non-US companies, which are certified according to ISO 27001? So at this time, CMMC doesn't have, or the Department of Defense doesn't have any reciprocal agreements around CMMC with any outside countries or other countries or outside organizations. So you're still going to have to comply with NIST 800-171. Now, the good thing is that ISO 27001, in order to get that certification, you may already have a number of the policies, procedures, implementation statements, etc., done for the different controls, but you're going to have to put them in that context. Because, if a when you engage with that certified third-party assessment organization, you really can't just, kind of hand over your ISO 27001 packet and say, here, figure it out. They're not going to do that, right? They're going to want it in their context, which is NIST 800-171. So you really should, take a look at NIST 800-171, figure out what from ISO you can leverage to meet those requirements, and there may be some additional gaps you may have to consider and fill. So I'd take a look and start doing that fairly quickly, so you'll be ready when the program itself is implemented. And that really also feeds into number 7. How does this apply to UK-based companies? Right? UK-based companies who are either working directly with the US Department of Defense or who are a subcontractor to those that are, right? You'll have flow down requirements if you're a subcontractor to these DFARS clauses that are in the prime's contracts, and you'll have to meet those same requirements. So whether or not you're a US-based company or a UK-based company, you'll still have to meet these same requirements. All right, everybody. I want to thank you all for your time and attention today. Hopefully, wherever you are, you're staying warm. I know where I am, it is very cold. So hope you all stay warm and hope you all have a great rest of the week. And I will be talking to you all soon. Take care.